Perfect. All right. Hello, everyone. Hope you're doing well. Hope you had a good weekend. I'll give everyone an update just on what I've heard in terms of our semester plans at this point. So the rest of this week and I believe next week are going to be remote for sure. I've been told that I'll get an update about our class February 5th. So that's next Friday. They'll update me about whether or not we'll be allowed to resume or begin face-to-face stuff for the following week. I assume it's going to happen at some point. It's just a question of when. So I'll keep you all updated as I continue to hear things. And don't hesitate. Let me know if you have any questions or anything. Yeah. So this week is going to look more like a normal week of the semester. We'll be more doing normal stuff than we've been doing in the past. So we're going to start working on Charles Taylor. So the Secular Age, start working on this book. We'll spend a good month or so probably on this book. We'll get a reasonable chunk of the way through it, actually, though we're not going to read every chapter of it. So we'll introduce Taylor's project today. We'll go through it at practice daily assignments, so you can all get some practice with those. Have a sense of what I'm looking for. The first daily assignments are going to be due on Thursday for you all. So you'll turn those in using Canvas prior to the start of class for next Thursday. Remember, they're 2 sentences. You'll see an example of one today. They're literally 2 sentences. So don't write more than that or anything. I have to grade 32 of you or whatever worth of these. So I literally do want the 2 sentences. So keep it brief, keep it short, and we'll go over an example, and then we'll that's what we'll do today. We'll work our way through the introduction and do that practice. So any questions about anything before we get started for the day? All right. Remember, you can unmute yourself. Please don't hesitate to do so. Let me know if you got questions via that format. You can send things to the chat. The general chat should be working now. So yeah, let me know if anyone has questions in that way, comments in that way. And yeah, want us to try to go through stuff as much as we can. So let's probably just start by doing a practice version of the daily assignment real fast. So for the daily assignments, again, you've got 2 sentences you're supposed to write. So sentence number 1, what is the author's thesis in today's reading? Now, there's more than one way you can write these out, right? There's more than one answer here. Indeed, as we're doing longer readings, there'll be more than one thesis statement even present. That's fine. When we get into some maybe harder readings, even Taylor and Nietzsche, whoever other people we're going to read later on, feel free to pick the part of the text you think you most understand in the course of answering this question, right? If you didn't get much out of the reading, but you understood one paragraph, what was the thesis of that paragraph even? That's fine. And maybe tell me what paragraph you're looking at, just so I can refer back to it if you're more unsure about things. So here would be an example of what could count for this first reading from the introduction. We could say Taylor's thesis is that secularism consists in the possibility of not being religious being live for many people within a society. And this was his 3rd definition. This was his secularism 3, or his third account of what secularism could mean. All right. Next sentence. Sentence number 2. And again, notice this is indeed a sentence. It is not a paragraph. It is not a page. I've had people literally turn in like pages to me for this. Don't do that. I want a sentence. That's a sentence. Second sentence. What's one reason the author gives in defense of that thesis? And so here would be an example of something that would satisfy that. Again, key thing, make sure that the reason you're giving me is indeed a reason for the thesis that you identified in the first sentence. So these 2 sentences should be related to one another. Here would be an example of something you could put in for this second sentence, maybe. Prior to relatively recently in human history. The possibility of denying God's existence would have been inconceivable. And if you want to check and make sure you're doing the second sentence right, that you're connecting the two sentences together, try throwing in a because. Treat it almost like a extended clause. Does it make sense if I write it like this? Secularism consists in the possibility of not being religious being a live possibility for a great many people within a society, because prior to relatively recently in human history, the possibility of denying God's existence would have been inconceivable. Bam. Works. The connection's clear. All right. This is literally all I'm looking for. This short is what I'm looking for. This is actually a case where the shorter and more concise you can make it, the better, actually. This is not a case where more is better. Part of the nice thing about being able to sort of like take something complicated, hone it down into something really concise and clear, you're making it really clear for yourself what you think was important in the reading. And that's really the purpose of these daily assignments just in general. It's to give you all a chance while you're doing the reading and shortly after you do the reading for you to sort of like figure out what's important and sort of why it's important in what Taylor is saying. And the more concise you can make it, the more narrow you can make it, the more confident you people tend to be that they're sort of getting things right. So that's what I'll be looking for on Thursday. Any questions, thoughts, comments about these daily assignments? Everyone good? Seems doable. Like I said, it should literally take you like a minute or two after you're done. You finish the reading. So they should be fast. Should not be a big part of your day. All right. So with that said, then if everyone's good there, let's actually turn to the Taylor reading. So I figure since we're going to spend a little time with him, a little bit more than a month probably, on Taylor, I figured I better introduce him to you. Who is this guy? He's still with us, actually. He's still, this book is relatively recent. This book is from like 2007. I think. So this is actually a relatively recent book. And Charles Taylor is still with us. He's a Canadian philosopher. His religious background, which perhaps is relevant given what he's writing about, he's from the Roman Catholic tradition. And his philosophical inclinations are to be sort of all over the place. He's one of those philosophers that's not super easy to sort of narrow down to any one particular area. He writes a lot with some continental authors. He also writes a lot with analytic authors, and he's also super into the history of philosophy. So for those of you who come from a philosophy background anyway, he's doing a little bit of everything. He's doing a little bit of everything. We saw it in the introduction where he name drops Wittgenstein, Heidegger, and Kant, and Plato. That's about hitting as all of the bases you can possibly hit of different philosophers that people can talk about. So his strength as a writer is that he's really good, I think, at details. And he's really good at drawing out some fascinating little exchanges that I think are super illustrative of some points. At one point, in probably about 2 weeks, we're going to read this exchange that he has where he found in the 1500s this manners manual, this like guide to how to be polite in the 1500s. And he found this like hilarious exchange in it, and I swear I'm not making this up. We're going to read this passage where this guide to manners suggests that when you're walking with your friend through the city streets, finding poop on the ground, picking it up and putting it in the nose of your friend and having him smell it is usually bad form, usually impolite behavior. And it's not just an idle anecdote. He's going to use this anecdote to tell us something about how people saw the world in the 1500s. Because I'm guessing none of you would need that manners guide. I'm guessing none of you have ever been so tempted. And it's really like, it's not just the story. It's like, it might be impolite. It might be rude to do that, right? And he's really good at drawing out what is different about the past. and past ways of conceiving of the world. That's why I think he's going to be a really helpful first figure for us to start with when we start to conceptualize different ways that things have been looked at. One of the things that he's a little bit weaker at, and we all have our strengths or weaknesses, his weakness to me seems as if it's not always an entire, he tends to go off on some tangents and lose the thread. At least it's hard for the reader anyway to keep the thread of where he's going with some things. So I'm going to give you some very specific excerpts. We're not going to read everything. We're going to try to narrow it down to some things that I at least think are really important, really pertinent, and they can tie back in to some of the questions that we're interested in. The whole book is worth interesting. There's fascinating stuff throughout the entire book. But I'm going to give you some pretty carefully selected segments, and even within those segments, there'll occasionally be tangents that you're not exactly sure what to do with or why you're reading. But that's his strength and his weakness. The thing that I want us to focus on today are basically three questions, or three issues. Questions is probably the right word. So first, I want us to figure out what he means when he talks about religion and secularism as ways of experiencing the world. I want us to go through his three accounts of secularism, and then I want us to go through his provisional account of religion. And the reason I'm calling this a provisional account is, as he himself acknowledges, the account that he is giving only is applicable in Western Europe for the last 600 years. He might think it goes back a little bit farther, but I've got some concerns that I don't even know if it applies to St. Thomas Aquinas, actually. I don't even know if St. Thomas Aquinas would have said, let alone the early Christian church. So this is a relatively narrow but useful provisional definition, because as I think he's probably correct, the way we all probably pre-reflectively think about religion is indeed going to be in terms of this kind of provisional account, or at least we in Western Europe in the last 200 years anyway. So those are the three things that I'm going to want us to try to talk our way through today. I think we could do it pretty easily. I really like this introduction, actually. The introduction is a big part of the reason why we're reading this book at all, just because I really like the way he's framing some things here. So yeah, that's the plan for today. Before we dive in, does anyone have any questions about anything, thoughts about anything about anything? All right, great. So let's maybe start here. So last week, and particularly the last class period on that Thursday, we talked a lot about the definition of words. And that's fine. I love words. I'm a huge fan about words. Words are great. There's even more words that we can talk about than we did. Later on in the semester, we're going to talk about the word dharma or dhamma from Sanskrit, which is relevant in Buddhist and Hindu contexts, and would be loosely the word maybe you would translate as religion in those contexts. I love words. Words are great. But our goal in this class is not to define words. And your goal in the paper that I'm going to ask you all to write for this class is not going to be to define the word religion. What I'm interested in is the phenomenon that word is pointing toward. And Taylor is similar in terms of his orientation, right? He gives those three accounts of secularism. You could choose just fiat. By secularism, I mean this word. I define the word. Fine. Right. But what's interesting is the phenomenon that he's pointing toward with these various kinds of accounts. That's the way that I'm going to approach things too. So I don't really so much care about what the word religion means, or the word deen, or the word dhamma, or whatever. Right. All that's fine. And again, we'll talk about it because it can be defining those words can be helpful illustrations. What I care about, and why I like Taylor, what Taylor cares about is the phenomenon that's being pointed toward. And how can we characterize and understand this phenomenon? And so when he's giving these three accounts of secularism, all three accounts of secularism are fine definitions of words, but they're all pointing to slightly different phenomenon. The phenomenon are all related. And so what we're going to want to understand is, what are the three phenomenon that are being pointed toward? How are those phenomenon related to one another? And how are they different from one another, perhaps? And so the reason he cares so much, the reason why he's going to so intently be arguing for this third secularism 3, what he's going to eventually call this sort of third account of secularism, is that he thinks that a way of describing the phenomenon is picking out something really important that other ways of describing the world are missing. And so it's picking out this feature of the world that he's interested in, not just words. The words are only tools to help us get at the world. So with that said, okay, what are we doing then? What is this phenomenon that we're going to be talking about? I'm going to be on the whiteboard, so feel free, again, unmute yourself, send things through the chat. Don't hesitate to let me know if you got some questions. Let's start here. Let's start with, what do we mean by the basic human experience of life that is involved in religion? Let's start with this question. What kind of experience, what kind of phenomenon in the world are we interested in explaining? And he gives us actually a relatively, I think, non-technical answer. He gives some words and stuff, but think of what he's doing here a lot, and particularly in this introduction, he's not engaged in anything super technical yet. He's pointing to certain things that we've all experienced and trying to get us to sort of notice them. And it's this idea, and so, someone said in the chat, this idea of fulfillment. I think that's exactly right. It's this sort of threefold ways that life sometimes feels to us. Sometimes we feel fulfilled. Sometimes we feel, I don't know, mundane or normal. Sometimes we feel empty. And this is, who is this we here? This is all of us. Every single human being who has ever lived in the world, right? This is not just religious people feel these ways. This is not just atheists feel these ways. This is supposed to be more general than that. And he's involved, when you're talking about what's true for every single human being in the world, you're going to have to speak in broad generalities. He knows this, that's fine. Right? Like I said, we're not being super technical with all of this stuff. But these are three more or less just almost like modes of experiencing the world. That's how to sort of think about these. If you are at all familiar with Heidegger, and there's no reason you should be, Heidegger called these attunements. That would be his word for this. So let's go through the normal one first, actually. Right? What's the normal experience of the world? What do you normally care about in the course of your everyday life? Well, you care about your normal everyday life. So what do you care about? Maybe you care about getting enough sleep because you didn't get enough sleep last night, because you stayed up too late, because you were working on a paper, because you wanted to get a good grade in your class. This is the normal everyday mode of experiencing the world, right? Where you've got various tasks that you're confronted with, and you want to be successful in those tasks. You want to be happy. Right. So what would be some examples of everyday tasks? There's your life with your family. Having a job, having friends, maybe having kids, maybe having aspirations about things you want to accomplish in your life. Right, the normal, it can even mean things like having food and being hungry and getting having a sandwich. In this mode, you want to do well in all of these things. And that is what we normally mean in a mundane sense by happiness. Happiness is doing these things, being successful at doing all of these things, right? So when you eat a good meal, what kind of happiness is this? This is the kind of happiness of accomplishing one of life's daily tasks, right? And eating is actually a great example of how how basic and indeed how utterly important this can be, right? If you've ever not been able to get food when you needed it, it can indeed be quite pressing. So we call this normal and mundane. We don't mean necessarily unimportant. We don't necessarily mean things that aren't pressing, things that don't involve perhaps a great deal of distress, right? Family life can frequently be really hard. Your friends can frequently be pains in the ass. Right? We all know that, but when we mean happiness in a normal, mundane sense, what we're pointing toward is just accomplishing the tasks of the day well. And what we're focused on in this sort of mode of being in the world just is accomplishing these tasks well, right? Most days when you're coming to class, my guess, no matter how much I might wish it were otherwise, you're not thinking like, oh, today will be this transcendent experience where I'm like put in touch with truth and reality itself. Most of the time, you're like, got to get through class, right? And maybe I'll get some stuff out of it. Maybe it'll be fun, right? But like what you're expecting, what you're oriented toward is getting through, getting by. How people feeling with normal every day? This again, my hope is that this experience is indeed normal and every day. That this is one you all indeed should start with having access to. Right? And indeed, most of our life is probably there. Right? Most of our life is probably there. Okay. Now, do you know what when CSU does surveys, because CSU cares, CSU wants to attract more students. When out-of-state students come to CSU, do you know what the number one reason why they come is? Skiing. They tell us that's what we've been told. The number one reason is to go skiing. Okay, why? Is skiing just some normal, mundane task that you want to accomplish in the course of all the other classes? No, no, no. When you're going down the mountain, you have this other kind of experience. Exactly right. As someone in the chat is saying, you have this fulfilling kind of mode of experience, right? What we could also call perhaps a transcendent one. So let's go back to this feeling of fulfillment. Right? This, Taylor suggests, is a mode of experiencing the world where you almost feel you sort of almost have to define it negatively. It's where you feel transported out of the normal mundanity of your day. Right? So, it's above too, like it's higher, it's better in some sense, right? But it's almost defined in terms of how it sort of exceeds to, right? This is a more. Or we can say I'll find this word later. I'll say this preemptively. We could also call this the transcendent, perhaps. Though we'll need to say a lot more. That's question begging a little bit, but that's at least where he's going to be going anyway. All right. Now, what is this going to look like? This can look radically different for radically different people, right? Again, we're talking in huge generalities here. We don't need to define this super rigorously. We just need to get some sense of the phenomenon he's pointing toward. So what could be examples of this moment? This could be maybe, this was a huge experience for me, when you're having those conversations with your friends, not just any old chatting with your friends, right? But when you're having the conversations with your friends that somehow transport you outside of everything, where you lose all track of time, you're not feeling hungry, you don't care about the work you have to do tomorrow, you're staying up late, maybe you've been smoking some herbal enhancements to help you get into this state, right? But where like, it's not normal. You're having a different kind of conversation. It can be those magical moments. Again, a lot of the time when you're skiing, probably it is boring and mundane, but the magical moments on the slopes, right? Those moments that are the reasons why you keep going back to get to. But if we don't have to talk about skiing here, right? We can talk about seeing a sunset. Right? That could be it. Something about that moment of seeing a beautiful sunset. See from the chats, some people saying, yeah, when you get in the zone when you're playing a video game, maybe. Right? Like not the normal, because video games can be kind of annoying sometimes, right? But that moment when you get into the zone. Other people brought up concerts. Exactly right. Like, right. Like, and again, not every time when you're going to a concert, but where like the magic happens, the magical moment. You could say if you're an athlete, maybe when you get into the zone, right? When maybe you're playing basketball where your shot's just going in. It's automatic. It's unconscious, we might even say. Right? You're not it's almost like consciousness is this. Right? The unconscious moment, the moment when you're in the zone in sports. Could indeed serve as an example. Artistic, something like a kind of flow state description. Yeah, it's exactly right. Sort of like an artistic flow state. And again, like, how do we know? Like, what's the marker that gives all these things away, at least sometimes, as being this other kind of experience? It's precisely the way in which you lose track of things like time. It's the way you lose track of things like the fact that you're hungry, or like your friend said something that made you like self-conscious and you're thinking about it. Oh no, you're not thinking about it right now. Right? Like you're taken out for a second by things. Yes, and indeed, perhaps some pharmaceutical enhancements could be involved in attaining this state, right? Michel Foucault, who was a philosopher from he died in the 1980s. He argued that when you're to break this, in a capitalist society, this mundanity is so much what we're in. To break the dominance of it, perhaps sometimes the pharmaceutical enhancement can help. But it's not reducible to it, right? Just you can be high just as a normal mundane activity, right? It's where like something like these magical moments can happen. And of course, so all the examples we've done so far are things that maybe anyone could describe. You also could have the experience of feeling the touch of God in your life. Or feeling at one with nature. My wife is a hiker, and that's the main form this takes place for her. This feeling this oneness of nature, this sense of something in that regard. All right, how are we doing? Good with these first two? And of course, there's no good without the bad. Now let's go to the emptiness, right? The emptiness too. This is, again, we have to define this sort of negatively against the normal and the mundane. This would be moments where you feel as if it is impossible to ever be fulfilled. Fulfillment is impossible, a dream. Maybe you never really did it anyway. Maybe you're just lying to yourself that you've had these wonderful, beautiful moments, right? And indeed, the mundane itself feels normal, empty. The kind of normal, mundane happiness that we're looking for too also seems out of your reach. The existentialists will, are not at all adverse to drawing out some of these experiences, perhaps, right? Things like moments of despair, anxiety, depression, right? That kind of thing, ennui, nihilism, right? That the world is just meaningless, that nothing means anything, nothing has value. Those moments, that is another, again, mode of human experience here. And sometimes, indeed, someone added in the chat, and I think they're right. Sometimes, indeed, the come down almost from this back to this can almost feel like this, right? It can, where the normal and the mundane that's previously maybe felt as if it had value lost it in some sense. It starts to seem empty of things. All right. All of these modes of experiences are supposed to be things that we all have access to, right? This is not like only religious people experience any of these, right? All people experience some version of all of these at various times in our lives. The claim that Taylor is making, though, is that, okay, when we're talking about religion and secularism, we're talking about a way of interpreting these modes of experience. So it's not as if only religious people feel fulfilled or whatever, or only the atheists ever feel empty. He's not making nothing like that, right? Everyone has these moments. Religion and secularism are going to be, on his view, ways of interpreting what's going on in these moments, way of interpreting, framing, understanding your experience, both individually and also collectively, how you do it with other people. Yeah. And so someone in the chat is asking, like, how do we, like, should we try to balance these or what? The answer to that question is going to depend on what kind of interpretation you give to the experience. Right? Different traditions are going to give very different interpretations. If you have a tradition like Buddhism, what is the Buddhist interpretation going to be? It's actually that everything is emptiness except for nirvana or nirvana, right? So what you should try to attain is to attain a happiness beyond the kind of mundane happiness of normal life. You should attain nirvana. If you're Christianity, though, Taylor says, Christian, one of the things that Taylor thinks is unique about Christianity is that it indeed says you should strive for this fulfillment, but not at the cost of giving up the normal and the mundane. That's going to be one thing we'll talk about later on in the semester. And so there, maybe you read it that way. Maybe if you're certain versions of an atheist, you deny that there is such a thing as these higher modes, or you explain them naturalistically back as a kind of mundanity or normal everyday life. Maybe. Or maybe 1,000 other things could happen. Right? I mean, one thing that we're going to see when we see how Taylor defines secularism, it's not any one belief. Secularism is going to be a million beliefs, and that's going to be the whole point. Secularism is going to be an explosion of different options. But what he thinks all of them are ways of interpreting what's going on here. So how are we doing? Is this okay to start with? Is this an okay initial? Everyone, again, he's not being super technical. Like, my hope is that all of you, even if you were like different experiences, you maybe characterize it slightly differently, you know what he's pointing toward in all of these moments. So everyone okay so far? Awesome. So now then, let's turn to his accounts of secularism. We'll do secularism first, then religion after the fact. And because weirdly, he's going to define religion is going to be defined kind of negatively, actually, in his accounts. Weirdly, or maybe they're both going to be defined. At the very least, they're going to be mutually defined. Their definition is going to be, they're going to mutually entail one another. So let's at least start with secularism. So, okay, you have all probably heard the word secularism before. And probably what you most normally people mean by it is what his second definition. So let's actually start with his second account of what he means by secularism. Can I erase this? Does anyone still need this up on the board? Speak now or forever hold your peace. All right, good. And I'm recording the session, so you can always go back and find things that maybe you didn't write down, you want to go back and look at later using that format too. So let's look at the 3 secularisms that Taylor posits. The first 2 he thinks are more or less normal, familiar things. The third one is what he's saying is novel. And again, he's not so much defining the word here. What he's doing is he's pointing to 3 different but related phenomenon and trying to understand their relationship and what's going to be the priority. And his claim is that actually the third one is going to be sort of what explains what's going on in the other 2 to some extent. All right, so let's start with his second. Actually, we're going to go a little out of order. We'll start with his second one, because I think his second one is probably what most of you would most normally think is meant by secularism. So secularism, particularly, this is how the word tends to get used amongst American Christians and maybe Western European Christians more generally, but especially amongst American Christians. This is the second one is what secularism tends to mean. Secularism means the phenomenon of a decline in belief in God and religious institutions within some country. Or at least a tendency in this direction, right? Rather than it being all or nothing. I mean, one thing that Taylor points out, because basically Taylor is going to be interested in basically 3 countries. He's going to be interested in the United States, England, and France. Those are the main 3 that he's going to talk about in this book. A few others are going to come up, but those are the main ones. I will talk a little bit about Germany, a little bit about Italy and Spain, but those are the main 3. Of all the ones that I've listed, the United States would actually be the least secular. Indeed, it's sort of an outlier in context of Europe in terms of how not secular the United States is. There is still indeed the overwhelming majority of people in the United States still say they believe in the existence of a God, right? So the fear of a growing secularism is that there will be a decrease in that over time. And then if you're coming maybe from a Catholic context, you also want to emphasize the importance of certain kinds of religious institutions. So it's not just belief in God that's declined. It's also, say, maybe confidence in the Catholic Church as an institution, for example. The Protestant churches tend to be less engaged with religious institutions. Okay, so this is the second one. This is probably the one you would most of all sort of expect to hear. This is the one that's probably most commonly spoken of. The phenomenon of just a decline in belief in God. Right? So most of Western Europe, this would be true for. Yeah, we would certainly see this in most of Western Europe. But to the extent that in many Scandinavian countries, people who posit any kind of affiliation with official churches or belief in God is something like 10 to 15% of the population. Right? It's an incredibly small percentage. There's another definition of secularism that's more common in terms of how let's say, loosely speaking, liberal. I don't really mean anything too careful about that. By sort of like by people who are more happy with secularism. Let's put it that way. People who are more happy with the emergence of secularism, the way that they tend to use it. This is the first secularism that Taylor points to. This is the removal of God from public life. Or the way Taylor puts it, I sort of like the way he put it, that you can sort of like go through public life and never encounter God anywhere. And again, this is a tendency, not an all or nothing thing, right? And in this regard, the United States would indeed be quite secular, right? It is possible to go through life in many parts of the country without really encountering much God talk. And indeed, there maybe are some parts where you could never encounter it. Maybe in other parts of the country, it would be quite a bit harder. Yeah, good. And so one other thing to note about this one here, we're talking more in a kind of a political or public or civic register. Right? Whereas in the case of the second one, this is more individualized. We're talking about individual belief states. And that's why it's possible for there to be a disconnect. The United States can be a secular society in a public or civic sense, while on an individual level, people still believe all kinds of things, right? One thing that would be open is that if there's going to be a place for God, it's going to be a private one within a secular society. But indeed, there still could be a huge place for God in private, right? That's fine. There's no exclusion here. Again, these are different phenomenon, right? Maybe they tend to go together in some cases, but they are indeed still different phenomena. Right. And again, this one, you're also probably familiar with this again, especially if you're studying things like civics or politics or whatnot, the sense of this of secularism as well. So again, let's pause for a second. How are people feeling just with these first 2 senses of secularism? Does these first 2 okay? Familiar, what you'd expect more or less, nothing too surprising. All right. Let's get to the surprising one. Let's get to the one that he thinks something is missing. Let's try to motivate this third one before we actually get to it. Something is missing from these 2 accounts. Right. And indeed a couple things are missing. There's a couple of problems he has here. So first problem he has with both of these accounts is he thinks it doesn't really, that neither of these are really adequate to explain the United States. The United States is so different than most of the rest of Western Europe with regard to these things that he thinks this can't just be enough. Even this claim that, I mean, certainly it's true that there's no like civic religions or anything like that within the United States, but even still, there's like encounters of God, and just like it just seems like this is not fully adequate, even if it is indeed pointing to something very real. Another problem he has is that he doesn't think either of these accounts explain or give us any sort of understanding of where secularism actually emerges. As we'll see, but this is something that we're going to talk a lot more about throughout the semester. He's really opposed to what he's going to call a subtraction narrative about the decline of religion. Right. And so what does he mean by a subtraction narrative? You've all probably, again, heard accounts like this. It's something to the extent of, in the Middle Ages, people were really stupid and superstitious, and they believed a bunch of dumb stuff. Modern science arises, all of those stupid, dumb beliefs go away, boom, secularism, right? So we just subtract a bunch of stupid things because of natural science, and we end up in modernity. And he's going to really strenuously argue that he doesn't think that makes sense. He doesn't think that works, and he thinks indeed that it overlooks the positive accomplishment that is modernity. Modernity and secularism and the secular self and yada, yada, yada. There's going to be the creation of something new, not merely a stripping away of other things, but rather creating something new. And he doesn't think that either of those previous two accounts of secularism are going to be capable of accounting for this new thing that's being created. This new thing that is going to be modernity in some sense. And so he doesn't think that either of these, both of these are just negatives. They're just about removing something, either removing God from public life or removing belief in God from individuals. They're both just removing accounts, they're subtraction accounts. They're not yet picking out the new thing that's made as a result. Or maybe rather the new thing that made these other two things possible, which is actually going to be his sense. Something new happened and that made the other two things become possible. And those are the central reasons why he's going to introduce a third account. So this is his third account of secularism. This is the novel one. This is the central one that he's going to argue to. Secularism is a condition of belief in the world. It is the condition of not believing in God. That's, again, it sounds negative, but this is actually an active state. The state of actively not believing in God. This state becomes possible for almost everyone within the society. And we're going to see the story that he's going to tell in the 1900s. It's going to become possible, not 1900s, sorry, in the 1800s, it's going to become possible for a few people, basically for like academics and elites. And then in the 20th century, that's going to become popularized and it's going to be possible for everyone. The important thing to notice here, though, is that we are just talking about the possibility, not its realization. even those who remain religious, it is a possibility for them that they could leave their religious faith. And this is especially working within the Hebraic tradition, so we can start using words like faith and whatnot in this context. And notice that there would be a connection here, right? If that's the case, then yeah, of course, there's going to be a decline in belief in God and religious institutions, right? And of course, some people are going to go that way. Others might not go that way. Of course, if people are starting to go this way, then maybe there'll be a decrease in the role of God. Indeed, maybe this already had to have happened before it could become possible for people to actually actively not believe in the existence of God. The claim that Taylor is making is that prior until relatively recently in human history, it was actually not possible for people to be atheists. Again, a few outliers, like a few weirdos. There were, decadents and all that. But that the mainstream person, even the mainstream intellectual, it was not an option for them. We're talking from a time period of around 100 to now, so 1000 to now, so about 1,000-year period. We're not going to worry about the ancient world. We'll talk about the ancient world later, because as Taylor is well aware, the ancient world doesn't fit the story he's telling, really. And also, a lot of the not Western world doesn't fit the story that he's telling either within the last millennia. But within the last millennia in the West, he's suggesting that this is a new thing, the possibility of not believing in God. So let's define what we mean by this, right? Because people have been giving proofs that God has existed for forever. It seemed to people as if it was the sort of thing that needed to be argued for forever. So what does he actually mean here? All right. What he means is, if you are a religious person living in modern day America, you know people who do not believe in God, and you don't think they're absolutely mad. Right? Maybe you think they're wrong, but you don't think that they're absolutely mad. Right? You think and you can tell at some points Taylor was speaking from his own experience. Right? He's a Roman Catholic, right? But he knows people in academia who don't believe in God at all, who he thinks are decent people, who he thinks are intellectually honest people, right? Not just idiots or something, right? Not just crazy people, not Satanists. They're not, eating babies or whatever, right? They're just people who don't believe in God and seem to be living that as a coherent way of life, as one option amongst all the other options for lives that people can live. And someone's asking, we're not yet at humanism. So hold humanism for a little bit later. We'll talk about humanism when we actually define what we mean by religion. So it's a good question. This is related, but hold the thought on humanism for just a second. All we need right now is just this almost negatively. We can just define it like, I don't believe God exists. Right? The possibility of that is conceivable. You all know people like that. You all understand that there are people like that, and to some minimal extent, you all think that's possible for you. Right? Maybe you too could be one of those people who don't believe that God exists. Conversely, though, the opposite is also true. If you're a militant atheist, you know that there are people who believe God exists. And if you know them, you're not just being hyperbolic or whatever, right? You know that they're not all just crazy people. You know that at least some of them are intellectually honest, that some of them are good people. Right? And they're just good people leading a different way of life to the way that you're living. One that, again, no matter how distantly, no matter how mildly, you could maybe even imagine converting to. Right? Or at least that people do convert to, Again, people who you don't think are bad have gone insane. Right? And not only that, there's way more going on than just those two options. Those two sort of extreme atheism, or maybe something like fundamentalist Christianity or whatever, right? There's a whole enormous range of options. There's more religious denominations and sects than you can shake a stick at. There are other religions besides Christianity. There's Jewish ones, there's Islamic ones, there's Buddhist ones, there's Hindu ones, there's traditional tribal ones, and not only that, you also know that there's people who are spiritual but not religious. And you know that there's a million different things that can mean. You know that there are there are people who are agnostic but not atheists and who really care about that distinction, actually. Like, it's not just like linguistic. There's weird philosophies out there. There's self-help gurus. There's cults. There's a million different ways of living. And you're just aware that there are these different ways of living. What does that awareness do? It changes the condition of you as a believer in whatever it is that you do believe. There's a kind of, in let's say 1500s medieval Europe, a kind of, he thinks, naivete to being Christian. The naivete is just the naivete that no one you've ever known is not Christian, so it's not something you think about. You don't think about whether or not you should be Christian or not Christian, because everyone's just kind of a Christian. You all, no matter how religious or no matter how not religious any of you might be, you're all aware in a more self-reflexive way that this is one stance you could take about the world, and that there are other stances you could take about the world too. Other ways of interpreting those fundamental experiences that we all have. And you might find yourself more or less tempted by the different options, right? Maybe some of you are so anti-religious, you're having a hard time even getting a foothold into why you would ever be a fundamentalist Christian. But maybe you can understand the crystal people, the people who like the crystals. Right? Or maybe you can understand being a Kantian rather than being Hume or something in philosophical terms, right? Like, you can understand like different ways of even being not super religious, and you get, or we can add in one of these that we haven't talked about yet. You can understand the sort of postmodernist Nietzschean possibility. That's, Taylor thinks, is a third thing that's neither religion nor not religion, that's doing something different entirely, which is why we're going to read some Nietzsche later on in the semester, in fact. You see these things as possibilities, and that is new. 200 years ago, maybe some of the elites were doing that, the highest of the high intellectuals. But starting about 100 years ago, you all now see this range of possibilities and can conceive of this range of possibilities. There are options for you. So how are we doing here? The important thing to note, right? We're just talking about the possibility with this third one. We don't mean actually not believing in God, but it's possible. You can imagine not believing in God and making that choice, living that kind of life. How are people feeling? Are people feeling okay so far? Again, questions, thoughts, comments about any of this? The thing that you all might find surprising is his claim that 200 years ago, this was not possible for the overwhelming majority of human beings. And indeed, even 150 years ago, it was only possible for still a pretty tiny slice, he thinks. And so one of the stories we're going to need to tell is, why was it not possible? What had to change such that this became possible for human beings when it wasn't before? So we good? We good so far? Any making sense still? All right. Then let's turn now to religion. Let's switch from secularism now. Let's turn to religion. We're going to use what we've said about secularism to help. Again, anyone still need anything on the whiteboard? Can I erase it? No complaints? Okay. Now we're going to get into some of the more technical. Now we're going to need to start being more technical, basically. We're going to start doing a little bit more technical philosophy here at this point. The reason we're calling this account of religion that Taylor gives provisional is because, as he's well aware, a lot of things that all of you are going to be tempted to call religions do not fit the distinction that he's going to draw in a second at all. Indeed, he doesn't go this far. I'm not sure how much he studied early Christianity. I'm sure he studied it to some extent. But based on the account of religion that he's going to give, the early Christian church is not a religion, actually. There's a distinction that he's going to draw here that is relatively late. I think it's even later than he thinks it is. Medieval philosophy is one of the big things that I do here at CSU. I have a friend who is insistent that the distinction that he's drawing, Thomas Aquinas wouldn't have even understood. And Thomas Aquinas is like 12th century. So like this might be a relatively late distinction. It's also a philosophically sophisticated distinction as well. So because of that, he's saying restrict it to say the last 700 years of Western Europe. He thinks this definition works as an account of religion in the last 700 years in Western Europe, and that's fine. We'll start last 700 years in Western Europe, then we'll go back farther, and we'll spread outward as we go throughout the semester. The provisional account that he's going to give is going to be predicated upon distinguishing the natural from the supernatural. Let's do this as a technical distinction, as a philosophically technical distinction. Okay, so the natural, what he means by the natural is a realm that has its own immanent laws that are, it makes perfect sense just on its own. So what do I mean by immanence? Again, we're starting to do some, we're starting some of the technical philosophy stuff here. So what we mean by immanent, we mean that the laws are contained and explained entirely within nature itself. So the word immanent literally just means like inside, basically. That's basically what this word means. In this context, it means the laws of nature are contained within nature, and you can understand them simply by studying nature. And so you can think here, maybe physics, that's fine, right? If you want to think about the laws of physics, right? The way we tend to talk, at least, is that the laws of physics are features of the natural world, and you can believe in those laws whether or not you believe God exists, right? That whether or not you believe in God or don't believe in God, it's irrelevant. You can study the same physics, right? Or laws of biology, or human nature, or psychology, right? Things that can be studied via sciences. And broadly conceived here. I don't mean, we don't have to mean anything super technical by science. Morality might be it's not something you think falls within this natural realm. You've all, again, I talked about this before. You've all probably seen the signs. You can be moral without God. If you believe that, you're saying that morality is then a feature of this natural world, right? And Kant maybe would be an example of a thinker who sort of thinks that, though. But something like that. Fiona, go ahead. Oh, okay, never mind. All right. So then what is the supernatural, right? I just want to emphasize the word super literally just means outside of or beyond. That's what the word super literally means. Right? So this is some realm or order that is transcendent of the natural world. Okay? And again, let's define what we mean by transcendence here. We're going to spend just advance warning, we're going to spend a lot of this semester trying to understand this word transcendence. This is not an easy word to understand, and the philosophical implications of it are vast. So we're going to spend a lot of time here. But provisionally, transcendence means, again, think outside, though we'll see that's not quite adequate, but it's at least good enough to start anyway. And so in this context, right, this is something that exceeds the boundaries of the natural world. Now, important thing to note here, because we use the word supernaturally really kind of not well in modern day, ghosts would not be supernatural. let's pause for a second. Even if this is the last thing we figure out today, I'm actually fine with this. Ghosts are not supernatural, properly speaking. Why? Is a ghost in the world? Does the ghost knock over shit? If a ghost knocks over shit, then it's in the world. Right? Then it maybe obeys laws we don't understand, but it would be within the natural order, right? Because the natural order is the order where shit bumps into other shit and knocks things over, right? Or goes boo or makes you feel cold, right? Again, there can be all kinds of physical laws that we're not aware of. Within a lot of Buddhist circles, the Buddhist law of karma, you all probably have some familiarity of this. This is the principle that basically, if you do bad things, it'll produce bad consequences. Buddhist monks are insistent that that should not be understood as a transcendent principle or as anything supernatural. It's just another kind of causal law in the world that's just different than the kinds of causal laws that have been discovered by the natural sciences, right? But that's fine because we defined, science, we want to define it really broadly. We don't just mean natural sciences here. There are economic laws. Economic laws aren't physical laws. They don't reduce physical laws in any obvious sense, at least. But we don't think that means that they're somehow supernatural, right? We just have a broad sense of what we mean by nature, broad sense of what we mean by sciences. And indeed, let's say we even someone in the chat brought up, what if there's sort of like alternate dimensions or something like that? Great. All of those, that's nature too, right? Why? Because you can study alternate dimensions in physics or whatever, right? Like, I mean, there's a line in Aristotle where Aristotle says there's only one universe. Really, the word cosmos is actually cosmos. There's only one cosmos because if there were two, then the cosmos would be both of them. Right? Like, you can talk about both of them. The cosmos, the whole, the universe, that's the one, right? And so heaven and hell now, so as someone brought up in the chat, those maybe would be supernatural places if we mean by it they're not places that are discoverable anywhere within nature, within the natural world. Fine, great, we're set. Now, one interesting feature of some religions is that the transcendent is going to perhaps intervene in the natural world. Possibly, right? Again, this doesn't have to be the case. You don't have to say this, but maybe you could. So maybe what we mean in this context, we could perhaps mean something like a miracle. As someone brought up in the chat, we could perhaps mean something like a demonic possession, if that were a thing, right? If the demon was indeed a supernatural entity, not an entity of nature that could be explained in nature, but that entity maybe could intervene or interfere with the operation of the world in some sense. Obviously, in Christianity, the incarnation of Christ would be an example of this, right? Where God literally became a natural dude. And indeed, Christian philosophy, what is at least early on, what Christian philosophy is most of all interested in explaining, right, is precisely how how God can be both man and also transcendent of man, right? So the transcendent doesn't have to be, and this is where we're going to run into all kinds of weird problems. It's not like completely unrelated to nature, but you don't need it to account for nature. That's the central distinction that's being drawn. And so Taylor correctly points out that if we accept this distinction, Platonic philosophy is not religious because there is no distinction between nature and Plato's theory of the forms. The material world in Plato is only explicable in terms of the transcendent principle. So you could say that the transcendent principle there is necessary to explain the natural in Platonic philosophy, but not within, let's say, late medieval philosophy. By the time we get to late medieval philosophy, we do indeed see this distinction. Right? It's debatable whether or not we even see it in like middle period or early medieval philosophy. But by late medieval philosophy, you do see this distinction within the Catholic world and within what will become the Protestant world. Right. Again, how are we doing? Everyone okay? Everyone have some sense of what I mean by this distinction? Right. We really, when we say transcendent, we really do mean outside, beyond, right? And outside of the scope of the natural order of things. So that's why, again, we're in the realm here of things like maybe miracles, demonic possession, yada yada yada. That's the realm we are. Whereas in some sense, something is transgressing into the natural to disrupt it, in some sense. Right. By the way, another way that the transcendent, maybe, say God, could intervene in the world is in these moments of fulfillment. Right? That could well be a moment where you are literally enthused. You know what the word enthusiasm literally means? Again, I love words. Words are great. This word literally means to be filled with the Spirit. And Spirit in the capitalized sense of the third person of the Trinity, the Holy Ghost. That is the literal meaning of the word enthusiasm, to literally be enthused, to have the Spirit in you. So maybe this fullness, that too could be a moment of the transcendent intervening in the natural order of things, right? Where again, what was the natural, normal, mundane flow of your life getting interrupted by something higher than it, right? That pulls you out of the normal to a higher way of life. Was there someone?
Sorry, I had a question.
Yeah, go ahead, please.
Yeah. So would then the transcendent or like the transcendental or whatever on the outside coming into the inside of the natural world become a natural phenomena? Like how
No.
does like how do you maintain the distinction?
So let's go to the person who is religious, because I haven't actually given you Taylor's definition of religion yet. To the person who is religious, at least, the answer to your question is no. That even when it intervenes, it still remains beyond, that what it's doing is dragging us up. It's not coming down to us. It's pulling us outside of normalcy, helping us become transcendent, to become enthused, filled with the Spirit, whatever, however you want to, it's bringing us up. So yeah, it still remains transcendent, even if it's able to become immanent inside of me too. It's still beyond me, even if it's within me. Did that help? Did that make sense?
Yeah, I was more specifically wondering about like if there's like a transcendent principle and it like causes the universe to be born in like the Big Bang or something.
Yeah.
Would that not then be a natural phenomena?
If it was the Big Bang, then that is a natural phenomenon. If it is a creator God that is not part of, because the Big Bang is in the universe. I mean, the Big Bang is both the creation of the universe, but the Big Bang already is the universe, right? Like, it's not like the Big Bang is something outside of the universe too. It's where the infinitesimal point, infinitesimally large point, like superheats and then like dramatically expands at an impossible rate or something. Like, that's still the universe. The creator God of Christianity is outside of the universe that creator God creates. Now, maybe the creator God creates it to have certain laws that it necessarily obeys. Fine. Right? It's a natural universe, but the cause of it is not natural. It's outside of the natural order that's thereby created. Good? Did that help?
Yeah, it helps a lot. Thanks.
Okay, awesome. Now let's end. We have about 5 minutes left, so let's end here. Let me give you Taylor's definition of religion. All this is preamble. So let me actually give you what Taylor means by religion. So religion is seeing the world such that true happiness, fulfillment, whatever you want to call it, requires something transcendent. Again, don't get too lost in the words, whatever you want to call this thing. The goal of human life requires transcending the boundaries of normal human life. Of the normal or the natural. So let's use that word too. Right. And therefore, there must be something transcendent that's capable of realizing this. And so Taylor actually argues, maybe against a lot of the Buddhists who I've talked to at least, that actually Buddhism fits within this description, because indeed the normal mundane life of, trying to have a lot of money and have sex with lots of people and have a big family and be politically powerful, the Buddhist claim is all of that is empty, all of that is nothing, and the only true fulfillment attains by attaining this transcendent higher principle, Nibbana. And Nibbana is transcendent, at least it's really going to be debatable, as we're going to see, whether or not it makes sense to call Nirvana or Nibbana transcendent. There's reasons to do it, there's reasons not to do it, but at the very least, it's transcendent in the sense of it's not the natural order of things. It's outside of the natural order of things, at the very least. Right? And in the Buddhist context, that means it's outside of codependent origination. That's what it's defined as, actually, is the end of codependent origination, the natural way that things occur. The opposite of this, the extreme opposite of this, is what he calls an exclusive humanism. So now we can get back to that humanism word that someone brought up earlier. True human happiness or fulfillment, again, call it what you will, the word's not what's important, is attainable entirely through human means. It's attainable entirely by going to work, making some money, having sex with people, having lots of political power, or whatever. Again, the specifics actually can vary wildly. Right? It's not the specifics aren't what's actually important here. What's important is that it's through human means and human activity that humans can attain whatever that human goal is, whatever that high point in human life is. The religious claim is that human beings themselves, human activity itself, is not adequate.
I have a question.
Go ahead, please.
My question is, when you say entirely through human means, would this also include like secular meditation? Like what I've heard, would that fit within exclusive humanism?
Yeah, the way, for example,
that was my question.
What was it called? The transcendental meditation or whatever? Is that maybe an example of what you're talking about? Yeah, the way that tradition understood.
I'll give you an example. Sam Harris.
Yeah, something like that. Perfect. Yeah, where certainly meditation is this valuable human activity, but it's a human activity.
Mm-hmm.
Right? It's not moving you outside the scope of the human, in some sense. Whereas, say, when you receive grace from God within Calvinist Protestantism, right? You can't give yourself the grace of God. Only God can give you the grace of God. Yeah. Does that help?
It does help. Thank you, Professor.
Awesome. Good. All right. So we're at the end of our time for the day, which I think is fine. I think this is a great way through the introduction. We're going to it's not like we're going to stop talking about any of this stuff. So this is perfect. We'll actually really begin straight away with what he defined religion as, and we'll do some stuff with going back to, okay, why was it impossible to not be religious is the question we're going to start with next time in the late Middle Ages. Why would no one have ever considered the possibility of this exclusive humanism thing? Because basically what he thinks happens is, sort of spoiler alert, right? This is the spoiler of the story he's going to tell. Once exclusive humanism becomes possible or thinkable, you have secularism 3. You have that third version of secularism. That's the thing you needed to get secularism off the ground. That could be a conceivable possibility. So we're going to try to tell the story of how is this exclusive humanism? How did it become possible for us? So we're going to start right away with that, with why was it impossible in the late Middle Ages on Thursday. All right. Thank you all very much. I hope this was good. Bring in any questions, thoughts, bring stuff in, because we're going to same topic for a while. And have a good one.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Absolutely. Have a great one.
Thanks.
Hi, Professor.